Welcome everybody to AMS webinar or Weather Band's latest webinar, SoCal Soaking the Atmospheric River event of January 2023 with Vivian Rennie and moderated by Erica Groche. Now, before we begin, I would like to address some of the guidelines for our webinar today. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please put them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It's going to be to the left of the chat button. Questions for speakers should be placed there. We want you to leave all the questions out of chat and just concentrate it there because it'll give us access to those questions directly and we don't have to wade through everything. So that'd be very much appreciated. We will also have some time for specific questions from the audience after the presentation or during the presentation, depending upon the flow of things. So with that being said, now I would like to introduce today's moderator. Thank you, Erica, for joining us today and moderating this webinar with Vivian. Erica is a certified broadcast meteorologist. After 18 years on camera, Erica stepped behind the scenes to become the broadcast manager for the AccuWeather network in 2021. And before joining AccuWeather, she was the weekend evening meteorologist for WNBC in New York City. She also previously served as an on-camera meteorologist for WPVI, the ABC-owned station in Philadelphia, and WUSA, Washington, D.C.'s CBS station. Erica served on the AMS Council from 2019 to 2022, and she is the incoming commissioner on professional affairs. She has served as a panelist, moderator, or presenter at more than a dozen AMS conferences and symposia. In 2019, Erica was a delegate to the World Meteorological Organization's World Congress, and her work with the WMO continues today. Erica received the Certified Broadcast Meteorologist designation from the AMS in 2012. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in meteorology from Penn State University, and she was named a 125th anniversary fellow of her alma mater's College of Earth and Mineral Sciences in 2021. And with that being said, Erica, I give you the floor. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Gideon, and welcome everybody. Good evening and good afternoon to those of you who are joining us from the West Coast. And I'm really happy to have everyone here with us today. I don't want to take up too much time giving an introduction, but I do just want to briefly say that this topic first popped into my head when I was at the AMS annual meeting in Denver in January, and I randomly ran into Vivian in the halls of the conference center there. And we got to chat a little bit about what had been already unfolding in Central California at that point. And then, of course, things only got worse from there. And that's why we have this webinar on our calendar for this evening. So thank you, Vivian, so much for agreeing to do this. A little bit about Vivian Rennie. She is the daybreak meteorologist for KSBY TV. She's been delivering the forecast to viewers on California's Central Coast from 5 to 7 a.m. every morning, pretty early, since October 2021. She grew up in Colorado's high country and received her BS in meteorology and atmospheric science from Penn State as well, a little bit later than I did in 2019. And then she started her career in Sioux City, Iowa, getting her start in the industry there. Now, aside from her work at KSBY, Vivian is an advocate for the usage of ASL, American Sign Language, in severe and hazardous weather coverage. I've seen Vivian's presentation both in person and online. It is fantastic. If you want to learn a few basic weather cues in the ASL style, you can learn them by going to her site. It is wxeditoolkit.com. And I'm going to put the link to that in the chat as well so that everyone on this call can see that. Now, without further ado, Vivian, why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much, Erica. I'm just so excited to be here and to chat about the storm that it's been so kind of commonplace to talk about here on the Central Coast. But now talking to some of my other members of the AMS, it was a big storm and kind of something that felt a little dystopian. So I'm excited to share that with all of you guys. And thank you so much, Erica and Gideon, for thinking of me with this. So I'll share my screen and kind of get going on what happened and what we saw over the last about 6 months here on the Central Coast, because it wasn't just one storm that was pretty intense. We had an insane season. We've been calling it a unicorn season here on the Central Coast, something unlike something that we've ever really seen. So calling it the SoCal Soaking, And I couldn't think of a better word for what happened. We were absolutely soaked, going from a region that we've been talking about drought for so long to some really intense storms, and specifically an atmospheric river event on January 9th of 2023 during the AMS conference. So kind of on that same topic, a little bit more about who I am. Like Erica said, I am the daybreak meteorologist at KSBY News. I cover the mornings there. I was in Sioux City, Iowa before that, and I have my atmospheric science degree from Penn State. And Erica talked about this a little bit, but the big question when this was happening was, where the heck was I? I have a particularly good skill of not being at work when they really need me. Every time that we have something big going on, it's the one day or two I am taking off there. So during this system, while my station was completely flooded, while people were not allowed in and out of the building, and while this massive storm was going on, I was actually in Denver presenting my research there. And a lot of my role in actually covering the storm was a way that I've never covered a storm before. Every storm like this before that I've covered, I've been on the green screen in the station. This one, thankfully, the amazing people at Barron were setting up an expo in the expo hall in Denver, and they were kind enough to let me jump onto their laptop. So I was driving the radar and getting interviews from Denver, and then made it back here pretty quickly to make sure to cover a lot of the cleanup and things like that. And thankfully, a lot of the other members of my team helped me get some of the specifics on the day that weren't something that I saw from slightly farther away. We actually didn't have a single meteorologist in the building when this was going on. My chief was trapped in his house because of flooding, so he covered this from home, kind of COVID style. And my fill-in was covering it while I was driving the radar behind her. So figured I'd get that out of the way so you guys knew kind of my role in this before diving into what we actually saw. So we're talking about the central coast of California. So that is, at least for this presentation, it does include a few more counties depending on who you're talking to, but California Central Coast is San Luis Obispo County, as well as Santa Barbara County. Highlighted a few of our major population centers. They really span between San Luis Obispo, Santa Maria, and Santa Barbara in these two counties. We also do include some of the Channel Islands, and this area is really where this January 9th storm took hold and just kind of sat for days and days at a time after the storm system started to move in. So even before we actually got going with the storm system, we were coming out of a whole other issue here on the Central Coast. We were coming out of really intense drought. So looking back at the drought monitor back in October of 2022, things were looking really bad. A lot of the headlines were very different than the headlines coming out today. So we had seen so little rain at that point. We only saw 2.6 inches of rain for the entirety of the water year of 2022. That runs from October 2021 through October 2022. And for about 9 months in the middle of that, from early December 2021 all the way through August of 2022, we saw 0.02 of an inch of rain total. It was an incredibly dry season. Those 0.02 of an inch of rain weren't even from actual rain systems. They were from a little bit of drizzle coming from our marine layer. So we were looking really bad, hoping to go into this winter, hoping for some rain to mitigate some of our fire chances. It was looking so bad at this point. We are all in severe to exceptional drought in my area, which is down in this kind of portion of California. We were just hoping that this exceptional, that D4 drought wasn't going to make its way into our region. It's really tricky. We had seen a lot of wildfires for the Alisal and Thomas fires. Those are two areas in our region that had widespread burns the year before. We also had widespread water restrictions. This was a time where most locations were charging really high rates for water. Everybody was keeping a very close eye on that. I only bring that up because things have changed a whole lot from that system, and at least from what we saw before then. So we went into this first portion of our water year pretty dry, not much going on from October through about the early December portion of the year. But then things changed really quickly from December 1st only through January 31st. In those 2 months, we had 9 official atmospheric rivers impacting this region of California. So far this year, we've seen well over 30 on the West Coast. That's higher than normal. We typically get the bulk of our precipitation from atmospheric rivers, continuing to see that kind of pattern here on the Central Coast. But this is way more than we typically see for a year. This is something that I really appreciated from the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. They've been so helpful this entire season with just where a lot of these landed and where a lot of these made some dramatic impacts. And so even some of the storm systems that made impact directly to our area were really intense. Also, some of these that fell into Northern California for their initial landfall made their way into the Central Coast, creating devastating effects throughout the entirety of the state. These are the same storms that brought the feet of snow to Tahoe, burying towns, lots of rain in portions of the Central Coast, even some tornadoes in the LA basin. So it's been a really weird year here on the Central Coast. But when we're going into the early portion of January, we've already seen some flooding happening, especially in streams and urban areas. The entirety of this area is really built for drought. So we're able to see how much water we can get and hold on to. That is not where you want to be when some of these storm systems come through. It's helpful to see how much water we can keep for our drought conditions, but in the actual days of a system can be really devastating. We don't really have as much drainage capacity as a lot of other places. It's kind of tricky there. So setting the scene for actually the January 9th storm, just a few days before it, we had another atmospheric river system that impacted us pretty severely. That atmospheric river made its way from San Francisco all the way down through Ventura. That goes the entire length of the Central Coast region of California. So from that system alone, we had widespread evacuations around all those burn scars. We had some debris flows from that first system as well. And that only brought about an inch to an inch and a half of rain across our region. That was a little bit of a precursor to what we had already seen that destabilized a lot of our hillsides and made for kind of a tricky start to this next system because there was a lot of debris already blocking drainage pipes. It was one of those things where we look back towards it and think that this system would not have been this bad if the January 5th system had not impacted us so severely. So we had those evacuations surrounding burn scars. A lot of people went back to their homes, and just a couple of days later, we actually had the January 9th system that I'm going to be focusing on for the next little bit of time. So this was the system as it made its way here. It was a monster of a system, that very typical Pineapple Express. I just pulled this from one of our Facebook lives from the days leading up to it, right before I headed towards the AMS conference. It was looking pretty scary out there. Lots of rain impacts felt widespread across the entirety of the West Coast, spreading a lot of our resources pretty thin. So for January 8th, we started to see this coming in. And we've been talking about the storm system for a long time. For those of us in the meteorology sector, especially on-air meteorologists, we don't call for 10 inches of rain when we're looking at the GFS 250-hour readout, but we are already seeing intense rainfall, 10 inches, even 12 inches expected. And we started saying that and talking about the potential for some really drastic conditions even before the January 5th system made its way through the region. Even during that coverage, we were saying, this is big, but something else much bigger is coming in the next couple of days. The Euro, NAM, the GEM, even the Canadian model, those never agree on the Central Coast in California. We're all calling for devastating impacts with inches and inches of rain that we don't really handle very well here. And then on the 8th, late at night, rain began in northern San Luis Obispo County around 11 p.m. And we also saw a pretty intense gust front that brought 50 to 60 mile an hour winds overnight ahead of the front. That became important a little bit later on in the day when we realized that a lot of the trees that were blocking drainage systems didn't actually come down in the bulk of the storm. They came down in that gust front. Something that's a little bit different about the Central Coast is a lot of our trees don't have really deep roots because there isn't a lot of water down there. So they have really wide spreading roots right at the surface. They topple incredibly easily. So that is something we saw a lot of. We've seen some drastic impacts to our trees here on the Central Coast, especially because not only were they kind of that shallow root system, also because they've been under stress for so many years that we saw a lot of trees falling down even before the system. That blocked a lot of drainage areas, that blocked rivers, and made for an extra bad situation as the storm actually made its way into the region. So as we moved into early morning on January 9th, we saw the initial cold front pass into northern San Luis Obispo County, or northern SLO County, as we call it, for a little bit less of those syllables. That was bringing rainfall rates widespread up to an inch per hour throughout much of the region. People weren't really thinking a whole lot of it at this point. We'd been calling for really dramatic concerns with the system, but we had just been through an intense storm. People were kind of thinking, I got this, it was fine. Our storm drains began to slow down really quickly. We already had a lot of debris in them. And then the first power outages began early that morning. The first time that the power at KSBY went out was also very early that morning. Evacuation orders were ordered once again surrounding many of those burn scars. One area on our south coast, kind of near Santa Barbara, actually was allowed out of their evacuation orders, was home for less than 5 hours before being evacuated again for another system. And they were out from the system for a significant amount of time. So we started it really early in the morning and it just didn't let up. It was moving pretty quickly, heading towards our region, kind of stalled right there. This is what we were looking at about noon on Monday, consistent rain all the way from the early morning hours, moving slightly south. Our heaviest and most constant rain was actually during those morning to early afternoon hours. Localized flooding closed most roads in the region. Our officials were saying, just wherever you are, don't leave, trying to pull out all the stops to make sure people stayed safe. One thing that's kind of tricky here is that we don't have a lot of big intense weather. That's something that I'm sure you all know when you think about California. We don't have really intense weather a lot, so people didn't really take a lot of the warnings seriously. So we were keeping a very, very close eye on that. People weren't taking heed as much until things started to close down and get really intense. And by that point, a lot of the time it's too late, but flash flooding is already occurring. At this point, early on in the day on Monday, actually while I was giving my presentation at AMS, we got the notification that KSBY studios were unreachable. A lot of the road had flooded earlier on that morning, but four-wheel drive cars were able to get through it. Not a whole lot, but they were able to get through it just at that highest end of where it becomes unsafe to drive through. And then power lines fell in the water and our studios were completely cut. The morning crew that was here. Everyone else kind of regrouped at the hotels down our hill and made a mobile newsroom there. Or we're broadcasting COVID style at home like my chief was. This is also when a lot of our hillsides began to give out, widespread mudslides and washouts began. Also in our area is Montecito. A few years ago, they had the Montecito mudslides that killed dozens of people and is a tragedy that we still talk about to this day. So when mudslides started to happen, people started getting really afraid. People started thinking really strongly about the system and people started really worrying about what was going on. Thankfully, they started doing that. I think things could have been a lot worse if they hadn't, but things were still pretty bad because it took for mudslides to start happening for people to really start taking heed of some of these concerns. This is an interesting radar graphic that I wanted to quickly show you of my chief actually broadcasting from home during the storm system with just bands of rain. You can see how many watches, warnings, and advisories there were, flood warnings across the entirety of the region for different portions of the storm system. And this is a kind of a higher elevation. I'll get to that in just a moment, but getting intense rainfall amounts up to 2 inches of rain per hour there. Another thing I want to point out on here is our thunder and lightning strikes. This was a atmospheric river, so we didn't have any thunder, any lightning, anything like that. It's just that deluge of water, not seeing any thunderstorm areas, but still pretty intense situations there. Thankfully, we didn't have any thunder and lightning. Taking a little bit more of a synoptic view of the storm system, we saw the rain making its way through pretty quickly and breaking into two portions of the system. So we did have that kind of secondary frontogenesis that is so common with atmospheric rivers on the West Coast. If you study them, if you know a lot about them, this happens most of the time. And the most devastating ones do have that secondary development with the system. You can kind of see it going into Monday in the afternoon hours, but by about 7 p.m., you can really see that first portion of the system and that secondary low that formed right in the wake, continuing to see those strong southwesterly winds that were really impactful for us here on the Central Coast, thanks to our topography, but also just that secondary system. We had a break of just a couple of hours and still more rain on the way. And even we weren't done then, we had even more rain systems coming. You can already see kind of the low over here. We had another system just a few days later. During the daytime hours on Monday, most of what we were talking about was washouts of roads, power outages continuing. Many locations were out of power for well over 2 weeks on the Central Coast. That's unheard of here, something that people said that they had never seen before. So as we headed into early on Tuesday morning, that's when our second round of rain really began, that secondary frontogenesis or atmospheric river family, as we talk about here on the West Coast quite a bit. That second round of rain began really early Tuesday morning, so only a couple of hours of break. And then many locations saw over an inch more rain from just that, more on our ridges and some of our higher elevations. But that second round, we saw a lot more damage than the first round, even though there was a lot less rain. I think a lot of that was because a lot of our areas were just holding on and were washed out completely during that secondary portion of the system. But the good news is we had a lot of our worst impacts on that first round because people weren't taking heed, people weren't really paying attention to that as much. We saw a lot more exercising of restraint of people staying in their homes for that second round, which I do believe helped out immensely in the impacts we saw. We weren't that lucky with our first round, even though we'd been calling for rain for weeks at that point, knowing that something was coming. Don't trust the GFS that far out, but we knew something was coming. So as we moved into later on the day on Tuesday, that front pushed through the region. We saw a little bit of that clearing and winds were able to shift more to that westerly direction, cutting off a lot of that direct moisture, that Pineapple Express moisture that we talk about a lot. And that southwest flow had really dominated. This helped to kind of right some of the issues that were already happening. And then we had a little bit of a break, and then we had yet another system make its way through the region, bringing over an inch more rain by later on that week. By this point, by the time we got through the end of January, we had seen inches of rain, more than was ever thought was possible here on the Central Coast. Pretty intense conditions. I think people are finally tired of rain here on the Central Coast, something that we don't typically see. So our topography is pretty important here on the Central Coast when we talk about atmospheric rivers, especially that southwesterly flow of our winds. The prevailing winds during pretty much any atmospheric river for us are that direct southwest direction. That's really important. We've got the kind of edge of those transverse ranges that go all the way into the LA Basin, into San Bernardino Mountain. They go into the Los Padres National Forest, which is these mountains. They've got that perfect kind of northwest to southeast direction. They are perfectly aligned so we can get as much moisture from those as possible. Also along our south coast, along the Santa Barbara coastline, we do have a ridge right above the city, a little bit of a break, and then another ridge. So we get that perfect coastal banding and extra mountain lift before it even makes its way into the mountains, further into the interiors, into the Sierras. We've got a few more of these kind of ranges, and they're all in that exact right orientation to cause a few more issues here and there. With what we saw, that was most particularly seen on top of our ridges. Most of our ridges saw more than 10 inches of rain from the system. Coastal Valley saw closer to 5 inches of rain. That's a lot of rain coming into many of these communities, many of the creek sides that had been dry, and unfortunately were homes to a lot of homeless populations in many of those creek beds that are typically dry. It's a pretty intense time, especially trying to get a lot of those people out of those areas before the rain actually started. So that's kind of what happened with the system and the rundown of exactly what happened at each hour. Here's what we saw, at least here's some of the records that we saw broken. So these are just for 24 hours on January 9th. These are not storm totals. I'll get to those in a minute. But we broke several records, 3 main records that I wanted to note. 4.22 inches of rain in just 24 hours at the Santa Barbara County Airport. If you've ever been to that airport, it is not built for rain. That smashed the old record of 2.83 set back in 2005. And that also broke several other records, one of which being that monthly record for single day rainfall in January, and that also smashed that record pretty quickly as well. We saw 3.42 inches of rain in Santa Maria at their airport, breaking that old record set back in 1907. 2.02 inches of rain recorded in Paso Robles, and that broke the old record pretty strongly at 1.18 inches back at our most recent really devastating flood, which was back in 1995. So these are a few more of the numbers of what we saw. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but a few that I do want to point out are places like the Alisal Reservoir. That's up on one of those higher elevations, right on one of those ridges. 12.37 inches of rain in 2 days. San Marcos Pass at 14.74 inches of rain in just 2 days, going down a little bit farther in those elevations, down to about 5 inches of rain in Montecito. We saw places like Lake Cachuma that were completely dry before this at 6.63 inches of rain just there. Many locations seeing inches of rain. Cal Poly and San Luis Obispo, one of our rain gauges, saw 7.2 inches of rain in just 2 days from the system. So it's pretty intense just looking at those numbers. That's not something we are used to here on the Central Coast. Also pointing out a few of these other concerns with our system. We saw some pretty intense waves up to 20, even 25 feet at some points that caused some coastal erosion. And also that wind and those shear vectors were pretty intense as well. Our winds got up to about 70 miles an hour from the system. So we had a lot going on with the system as it pushed through the region really quickly, continuing to see damage still to this day that is being unearthed from the system. In the immediate aftermath, we had a lot going on. There was a pretty intense levee failure in one of our communities called Oceano. This entire shaded area that kind of did a little bit more rudimentary was entirely underwater at several points of this year. This entire levee failure was really impactful for many locations. That airstrip is just reopening over the last couple of weeks. And this was a storm back in January. Residents remained under evacuation there for over a week. Then we had more systems later on in the season that brought them into those evacuation orders once again. We also had the Alisal and Thomas burn scars. They were evacuated due to debris flow risk. Thankfully, no large debris flows happened, but there were still quite a few debris flows that did make their way through the region. Los Osos and portions of Morro Bay were also evacuated due to mudslides and those creeks overflowing. Those are two more of our communities that were really intensely impacted. Those Los Osos and Morro Bay areas were really impacted. That's where a lot of our FEMA numbers came from. A lot of our damage numbers came from those two communities. We also saw some significant bridge and road failures. Highway 1, the PCH, that iconic highway, was closed due to rock slides and many locations of that just falling straight into the ocean. That road is still closed to this day. They're expecting opening it back up later in July. There are communities that still to this day are doing hour-long detours around portions of that, and they're only allowed in and out about half an hour in and a half an hour out once a week to do resupply missions. Those communities are still trapped from this system. We also saw many bridges completely washed out. Low-lying and low-clearance bridges were washed out or closed completely. One image that I want to point out is this one down in the lower portion of the screen. That creek is actually usually just a trickle of water about 30 feet below where you see that water level is at that point. Can't really tell that, but these are full-grown, very tall trees at this point. This is an overlook over the river, and you can see just how dramatic those changes were. Really quick flowing water, lots of debris flowing in that, causing some issues downstream as well. This is another bridge that is a very far change from what we typically see. You can see a full-grown tree there, completely taken over by water. There's plenty of trees down there, but you can't see them because they're completely covered. I wanted to pull one quick image from the Salinas River up in Paso Robles. That is where we saw some of our most devastating impacts. So we had two pretty big systems in the days leading up to this that everybody kind of saw, we dealt with, it was fine. And then we got to the system, and this is just a couple of hours into the system, and you see just how dramatic that rise in those flood stages were. We ended up at a flood stage over 35 feet at that. This was at about 29 feet, completely overtaking many of these bridges, causing really devastating impacts to communities that were cut off. And this is where we saw some of our worst impacts of the storm system. Talking about those worst impacts, we had 3 fatalities from this system. It has been decades since any issues on the Central Coast have been ruled storm related. So we've had 3 that were ruled due to the storm specifically. One in Avila Beach, where a car was overtaken by floodwaters, and she was unable to be saved from that. A man in Morro Bay, a 78-year-old, was a resident of a boat stored in one of our communities. He was actually storing that boat on land and refused to leave that, and his death was also ruled storm-related. And the one that we continue to talk about to this day is a 5-year-old named Kyle Doan. He was on the way to school. They hadn't canceled classes still, even though we'd been talking about this for weeks at this point. Many locations said it's fine, didn't cancel school. He was washed out of his mother's arms on the way to school in the Salinas River Valley. So a truly devastating time on the Central Coast. and search efforts are still ongoing to this day. There's still widespread efforts to see if they can find any trace of him, and we're months out. I did pull up a couple of photos from that search there, and this is one of the widespread searches that the California National Guard and hundreds of members of the community did, scouring those river valleys in the days, weeks, and months following the storm to see if they can find any indication of Kyle. So this was a storm that everybody has been talking about since, especially seeing these really dramatic impacts and unfortunately the fatalities that came out of the storm system. That's something we don't talk about here on the Central Coast pretty much ever. California has great weather and we don't talk about these things. It was tricky, and especially when schools were they were already called in session. Many of those people who had damage and who were injured were also due to lots of schools not being canceled up until times when they were already supposed to be at school. So here's a few other photos of some of the devastation across the Central Coast. We had farms that were completely underwater. This is a barn that was completely underwater for weeks after that levee broke. More farms seeing lots of rot. This is that creek once again, and many of these roads completely cut off. We also saw lots of helpers here on the Central Coast, but in true California style, a lot of people were finding their neighbors and seeing what they could do to help, wearing their wetsuits on their surfboards throughout many of our communities. So that was kind of a way to brighten the mood once again with what we saw. We saw lots of people helping out, but in their very, very much California way, where pretty much everybody has their surfboard and their wetsuit, and people were helping out significantly that way. So that was one system that we saw. That was January 9th. It was truly impactful, a really dramatic storm system here on the Central Coast. But when we look at the season, it's not even half of what we talk about for much of the day. So the rest of the season was pretty impactful. We had our first ever tornado warning issued by the National Weather Service LA office. That was on February 22nd, a day that I am not going to forget here on the Central Coast for a long time. I was the first tornado warning that most of our viewers had ever seen here on the Central Coast, and that was on February 22nd from another system. There's also several other tornadoes that caused damage in the LA basin over this year, which is something we don't really ever talk about here. We had about 15 other major flooding events, none as severe as January 9th, but much more flooding, a lot more damage. And then we also had 4 large-scale snow events, many locations seeing feet of snow. In the Central Coast, you can see wineries completely dusted in snow. Some areas, I love this photo of people surfing with snow in the background. And then many of our locations in the interior valleys, amounting feet of snow from the last couple of systems. This was a system that was back in March, another atmospheric river that pushed through the region that was really intense, seeing dramatic flooding once again. And then we also saw many of those bridges underwater once again from many other systems. Looking at the season as a whole, we've done pretty well in our water year. So for average water year to this date, we are getting into our drier season. So those rain totals don't increase too much typically across the rest of the year. We're at 200%, 207% of the average of the year to this date. And if we just cut off the water year right now, we'd be at 199% of total water for the year. So doubled what we typically get. And that's on top of years where we got less than 10% of what we typically get. We're normal here on the Central Coast. Santa Barbara saw a little bit less than we saw in San Luis Obispo. Santa Barbara is about 164% for the average to this date and 157% for the total water year. So we did pretty well on those rain totals. Looking at some more rain totals across the region, our average rain in the Santa Barbara area is about 14.3 inches of rain. This season, we saw 35.57 inches of rain from this system and from this season. In San Luis Obispo, we average about 13.2 inches of rain, pretty dramatic from the about 2.6 that we saw just last year. This season, we saw 47.15 inches of rain. Looking at one of our readouts for how we look at our season rain totals in some of these photos behind, all of those red numbers are areas that are above the threshold for major impacts to the region for the season. So this is for the last month, still seeing these in the red in the dramatic problems with those. And pretty much every location is red. A lot of those ones that you still see that are green, Those are all broken rain gauges, ones that didn't have the ability to capture all the rain that we saw. We saw massive loss in many of our ASOS and our mesonet sites. Many of our storm observers didn't see all of their rain gauges being washed away. So we are missing a lot of data from this storm system. And you can see that in a few of those green spots, but pretty much no location in our region got away without some major concerns. You can even see some areas around those burn scars. That's kind of that brown highlighted section there, over 35 inches at the coast, 57 inches heading up into these higher elevations in the San Ynez Mountains that are right here. It's a pretty dramatic year. I know I keep saying that, but it is a wild thing to see. So one thing that was really good about it is our drought monitor improved greatly. So I love this little animation on, you can see what it's like now versus what it was like back in October. Dramatic changes to what I showed you earlier on. Here's a look at those side by side with a few more numbers. At this point, things are great, especially when we look at our drought conditions here on the Central Coast. Going into the year, 100% of the state was in at least that drought stage 1. Most of the state was in at least severe drought, and large portions of the Central Valley, where a lot of our food comes from, was actually in that exceptional drought, that worst drought. We had a DSCI of over 351 at some points in the year. At this point, it has even fallen a little bit from this image, about 43%. This was from a couple of weeks ago, and we have seen rain since then, once again. And now we're at about 5% of the state under any version of drought, about 25% of the state under that abnormally dry, that D0 category of drought. So that's a great improvement here on the Central Coast. Our reservoirs really saw great improvement as well. Looking at a few of those, this is one of the reservoirs in the San Ynez Mountains. You can see just a year ago how dramatically low those areas were. Most of the area was completely dried up, then continuing to see those completely filled at this point. Because we do talk a lot about drought here on the Central Coast, I show our reservoir capacities every single Friday. Here are two that I showed this year. On August 5th, many of our locations were less than 20% of their capacity filled. They got even worse than this, but this is what most of those were showing. Continued to see them dropping lower and lower. Many locations less than 10% of those reservoirs filled. This is what I showed on May 4th. Continuing to see over 100% of the reservoirs filled at Salinas, Lopez, Whale Rock, Kachuma, Gibraltar, and Jameson reservoirs. Those reservoirs combined get most of the water for our entire region. So that's looking great. It was a storm season that we never thought we'd be able to fill up, especially when we were looking at areas like Lake Nacimiento, which is at 95.4% of their capacity filled at this point. Just a couple of months ago, it was less than 15%. So it is really great to see that. We are still attempting to conserve water as much as possible. It's best to do that when we have water than when it's too late. But things are much better here. We have seen some devastating impacts, but this is always a good cherry on top with really much needed conditions here on the Central Coast with a lot more rain. Some of the short-term impacts I talked you through, long-term impacts we're going to be feeling for a very long time. So we've got some pretty intense coastal erosion, bluffs collapsed across the region. Millions of dollars in infrastructure repairs are continuing. We haven't even established totals for many of our destabilized bluffs that a lot of people live on. We also had some pretty interesting bets going on the Central Coast. This bench in particular, there was widespread betting on when it was going to fall into the ocean. And a lot of people, I think, made quite a bit of money on that, but we were watching these bluffs fall day after day for months around not only this system, but around the entirety of the last couple of months. We still have FEMA involvement pretty dramatically here on the Central Coast. We saw some of the numbers actually come out just a couple of days ago with that FEMA involvement, seeing over $6 million in direct relief to residents here on the Central Coast. And that doesn't include any of the global or federal relief that we're seeing. And only about half of those claims have been completely ingested into that system. Also, we saw a lot of seed and field rot. We are one of the largest producers of strawberries across the entirety of the country. So strawberries might be a little bit pricier as we head into this season. A lot of strawberry damage to the main growing season. Many locations saw complete washouts, and many of those fields are just coming out of being underwater. One good thing though, we had the best super bloom that has been seen here in a very long time. You can actually see portions of our super bloom, those vibrant yellows and purples and oranges, seen all the way from space. So that was another kind of golden shining side to the storm system and to what we saw this year. Beautiful conditions with that super bloom. So kind of statewide, there was a lot of other impacts. We saw the Sierra snowpack, looking at areas like Tahoe, places completely buried under that snow, looking at January 2022 versus January of 2023. Look how widespread a lot of that snow is. Also, a lot of that sediment transfer into our oceans. That was pretty dramatic. Lots of conditions with that. We have seen some concerns with some algal blooms off our coast because a lot of the things that were actually washed into our oceans. Also, for those who don't know what Lake Tulare is, and Lake Tulare is a lake in the Central Valley that has been dry for decades. It was dried out for agriculture, and that is filling up very quickly at this point. Thousands of acres are underwater to this point because of a lot of that snow melt from a lot of these systems. So that's kind of what we saw with this system. For a news station of our size, we're pretty small. We don't typically see large systems like this. So this is a look at what our homepage looked like just a couple of days after all the storm coverage, really intense conditions. They're searching for Kyle Dome still underway, roads reopening, even many of those flooding concerns continuing to go on. During the actual day, about 7 a.m., those roads closed. We couldn't get people in and out. We are rendered impassable without power. We are working on generators for over 24 hours. Teams were working remote in the newsroom set up down the hill at a hotel. Also just mainly working out of their cars in these little reporter teams of 2 all across our region. We also had many reporters come in from across the state to help us and across our company to help us as well. We also had many of those extended coverage preempting national all the way from about 10 a.m. Monday all the way through Tuesday afternoon. So we did well over 12 hours of news just in that, and then even more continuing to cover with updates and things like that. So it was really intense here on the Central Coast. I unfortunately didn't see as much of it as I guess I would have hoped. I love being at AMS, but I was covering it from the sidelines. So I figure, why not show you guys what it was actually like covering it? So I put together a really quick little montage of some of the highlights of what we saw and what we covered during this. And starting off with some silly stuff from my chief meteorologist as well, who was actually stuck at home. So here, I'll let you guys watch. It's about a 2-minute video of some of the scenes that we saw on the Central Coast due to this.
Good evening. We interrupt your regularly scheduled programming with breaking news. It took me 2 attempts, and somebody had to come and pick me up to get up to the studio today. You're working from home. Nina wasn't able to get here. We've got crews spread out all over, working from various locations to try to kind of keep everybody up to date. So we're doing the best we can.
Now, I want to show you some shocking images earlier today. That's the Montecito Creek. You can see why there is a level of concern.
Good evening. I'm joining you from Highway 101 near Avila Beach, where you may be able to see behind me the northbound lanes in this area are almost completely underwater. And from where we are standing, the scene paints a pretty clear picture of what happened earlier this afternoon. It came over here bringing objects along with it. They look like objects from another house. Maybe we see overturned patio furniture in this front yard. We even found a family photo. So sentimental objects just being washed away. We see things that look like they came from someone else's kitchen, a smashed salsa jar here, a cookbook left in the driveway here, filled with mud and water.
KSBY's Jacob Dizon joins us live with a look at the conditions in Montecito. Jacob?
I made it down to Montecito late this morning, and ever since then, the ongoing heavy downpour has not let up.
At 4 and 5, we were out here live showing you the damage after a large eucalyptus tree fell over South 4th Street, hitting part of this landscaping business across the street. Now we're going to show you much of the scene has been cleared.
KSBY News anchor Neil Hebert is live there. Neil, what's it looking like out there?
Yeah, Janelle, the rain is coming down pretty hard, and that, like Claudia mentioned, those wind gusts, every once in a while it just comes and hits you in the face. But if you look down to my left, this is Morrow Creek, right by the Silver City West Mobile Home Park.
The rain is just staying pretty consistent. It was a heavy about 10 minutes ago, lightening up a little bit. Winds are picking up. As you can see behind me, I'm standing in front of the Arroyo Grande Creek. The water is flowing. The water level's not so high just yet, but it doesn't mean that that's not going to stay that way because the ground is saturated.
So that was just a little bit of what our coverage looked like, not only for a couple of days, but for weeks surrounding this system. It was a really intense time. I was unfortunately not able to be there during the bulk of it, was helping from behind the scenes, but our team here has been just so amazing. And the community has really responded. The way that people talk about and take advice and take those warnings has completely done a 180 from the start of the season to now. I didn't realize how strong this community was until we started to see some really amazing people really making a difference here on the Central Coast. So thank you guys so much for letting me chat a little bit. Here are a couple more additional resources if you want to know more about this storm system. Myself and my chief meteorologist did about an hour-long special on this storm system, and that QR code right there is that season recap special. Also, all of my notes, additional resources, kind of that bibliography side, and many more stories about exactly what was happening is in that secondary one. And if you guys ever want to contact me about any of this or any of my other research with ASL, also all my contact info and that website, that whether a WX EDI toolkit is on that third area of our QR code. So thank you guys so much. I'm going to send it back to Erica with some of our questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Vivian. I mean, that was really broad in scope, talking about the setup, the impacts, and, not only the immediate consequences of these atmospheric river events, but then the downstream impacts that you're still feeling to this day. So thank you for such a really comprehensive look at this storm system and what it's doing for you now. One question that we have here in the chat that I want to get to right off the top, because some of the folks here might not know what an atmospheric river is. So can you just briefly describe what is an atmospheric river?
Absolutely. So an atmospheric river is, we also call it a pineapple express sometimes. So it's what we talk about, especially with our viewers, is kind of a super highway or a river of just water coming from the tropics, originating kind of around Hawaii. That's why it does get that name, Pineapple Express, making its way across to the West Coast. It's how we get most of our rain, hitting those higher elevations, and it's already a really saturated air mass. And as soon as it hits many of those mountains, it just drops a lot of that water. I believe I have an image with a little bit more information. So we get that river of water coming in the atmosphere. It hits those higher elevations and just drops bands and bands of rain. It isn't really a convective system. That's why we don't see any areas really thunder or lightning or anything like that. It's just a super highway of water making its way towards us.
And it's really the mountains that trigger that rainfall, right? This is something that, like you said, it's not convection, so you're not seeing like towering thunderstorm clouds. It's something that, the atmospheric river has a lot of what we meteorologists call precipitable water, right? The water is still trapped inside the cloud, but then as the elevation increases, a lot of that moisture condenses out and forms that precipitation, correct?
Absolutely. And it becomes a little bit tricky, especially when people are looking at their cell phones or they're looking at the radar kind of a little bit farther over our coast, over the ocean still. And they'll say, it's not raining. It's not a problem. But the second it starts getting even to that smallest amount of uplift, even those first coastal bluffs will start to get a lot of that water out of the region and really make a huge difference. It can go from no rain, just a couple of 100 feet across the coast, to dramatic rainfall in those mountains. So it's a tricky form of forecasting, especially talking about that risk. And I think people on the Central Coast are kind of getting it now, but it's something that before this, most people didn't really know, or we talked about it maybe once a season, but they didn't really know an analog for it.
Yeah. Nothing like a catastrophic event to increase your weather knowledge. I think that's one of the reasons that the most weather savvy folks that you encounter in our country tend to live in the Great Plains states, right? That's where they know their severe weather inside and out. I want to kind of combine two questions, one from Tyler here and then from Paul, because this is something that I've been wondering too. How in the world in a La Nina year do you get so many atmospheric river events?
So we've been talking about that a lot, and how in the world, not only is this on a La Nina, a triple dip La Nina here on the Central Coast. We were walking into this season going, I hope we get any rain. I hope we get anything. But here on the West Coast, we don't have a great analog, especially for triple dip La Ninas. It's happened so few times. We don't really have any analog seasons for it. And what we saw is we just saw that low pressure sitting just up a little bit farther towards the north of Hawaii and just continue to kick off the same pattern. It felt like a lot of the time we were covering the same storm system. Felt kind of like Groundhog Day, deja vu with the exact same system time after time. And there's still going to be a lot of science, I'm sure, that's going on trying to figure out what the heck happened this year. But I do think that we started to see that instability and it just never really left. We never really cleared that large trough of low pressure, semi-permanent, kind of looking a little bit more like those areas like the Aleutian low that we talk about so frequently, just kind of always there all the way through the season. So I don't really know, and I don't have a great answer for what the heck happened, and I don't think we will for a while. It was nothing like I expected.
I wouldn't be surprised if there are some universities that wrote grants specifically to fund research into this specific event. And I bet the papers are going to get published in AMS journals and analogous journals in the years to come. It's going to take a long time to really diagnose this one, isn't it?
I think it really is. And not just this storm system, but the whole season was really rare. We saw snow, we saw tornadoes, all from completely different storm systems. It felt like a once in a lifetime storm every single week. I think that the research that's going to come out of this is going to be absolutely amazing. And hopefully it'll give us some answers to what the heck happened.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Another kind of research-oriented question from Paul. Flooding areas are usually analyzed and categorized. Floodplain regulations he's talking about. So, people need to be able to see whether they live in a floodplain. I know FEMA does this stuff. I think it's every 10 years they reassess. A lot of floodplain maps are really out of date around the country. It's not just a problem in California. But he references the return interval. So my guess is that that's similar. I've never heard that term before, but my guess is that's similar to a return period for hurricane landfalls, which is something I'm a little bit more familiar with, being an East Coaster. Do you know if any assessment is taking place on that to see where these flooding events rank with comparison to the return intervals? So let's say that one town flooded 3 times this past winter. Do we know how often that specific town floods typically if you take it over that return interval?
I think I know kind of where we're going with this. I don't have a great answer for this because a lot of our towns just haven't really flooded, and at least haven't flooded this amount. So many locations here where we are kind of getting bogged down into was this a 1,000-year event? Was this a 100-year event, a 20-year event? At least that's something that we heard a lot from our viewers here on the Central Coast, and we didn't really have many analogs for it. I think that a lot of the research is already going on. We have seen crews, and especially crews out there, and they've been out there since these storm systems, redoing a lot of those flood maps. Most locations on the Central Coast hadn't seen those updates. We're right on that edge of where that 10 years where they have to start redoing them already. Many of our creeks and reservoirs and areas that are in those, people don't really think about because, yeah, they're on a creek, but we don't get rain. So it doesn't really matter. So a lot of people that I interviewed, and especially some homeowners that lost everything that I interviewed from the storm system, said, we had signed the papers. We knew we were in a flood zone. We knew there's a creek in our backyard, never thought it would actually happen. So I think this is going to really change how people think about those flood stages, how they think about flood intervals here on the Central Coast, because the last real storm that made this much of an impact was back in 1995. So most people who live here don't really have a great knowledge of what can happen. And I don't know if that really answered the question, but that's something that we've been thinking about a lot here on the Central Coast.
I think based on where we are, because it's only been a few months, I think that that's a great answer for now, right? Because there's so much yet to be learned. And, talking about those homeowners who just didn't think that it would happen to them. I think, Vivian, you and I have talked about this, that recency bias that people have, right? So a lot of people are concerned about this now because it just happened. And then in 5 years, people are probably going to start dropping those flood insurance policies, unfortunately. But to Paul's point about return period, hey, the longer you get away from the last catastrophic event, the closer you probably are to the next one. So it's actually the opposite of the way that our mentality should operate, but a lot of people have that recency bias.
Absolutely. I think that's something we're going to really focus on a lot here. A lot of people in this area are currently focusing on, okay, what infrastructure projects can we do to be flood resistant? And you can have a flood resistant city. It's just going to cost all the money that we have. And trying to balance right now, a lot of our legislators in this area are trying to balance how do we become flood resilient and how do we capture as much water as we can, because it's more likely that we're going to be back in another drought as quickly as possible. How do we deal with both making sure we take care of that and not spend all of our money on becoming kind of a more flood resistant community? And I think that's going to be a really interesting debate that's going to start happening over the next couple of months and years. So what do we do now? Do we put all our money in flood resistance, or do we kind of go back to what we saw before? I hope it's going to be a little bit of a mix of both.
Yeah, I mean, it was only within the past few years that the number of losses, insurance losses due to wildfires reached a threshold where insurance companies started saying, we're not going to write a policy for this area anymore. Like, you know, it took so long to get to that threshold for wildfires. And now you have to throw flooding into the mix as well. So yeah, a lot to be learned here. One thing that you just said in your answer though, Vivian, makes me want to go back to another question. Paul put a few questions here in the chat that I think are worth touching on. He's talking about the Climate Prediction Center has a very high chance of an El Nino event developing within the next few months. They think it's a 90% chance actually that we'll have one by the JJA, the June, July, August timeframe. So with that in the forecast, what are you and other forecasters in your local area expecting to see in the coming months?
Absolutely. Myself and my chief meteorologist talked about this at length in our hour-long special, because here on the Central Coast, and El Nino typically brings us some more intense rainfall. So we've been talking about that with a lot of viewers that we have a lot more analogs for El Nino events than La Nina events. So we do know a little bit more. It's always kind of a little tricky to see exactly what's going to happen, but it does indicate that we'll see more rain next year. Thankfully, there's no indication that it'd be as crazy as this one, but we also didn't have indication for this year. I do think we're going to be seeing a lot more rain on the Central Coast because of that, and continuing to see a lot of times, especially in that June, July, August timeframe, when we do think we're going to start getting into that next kind of area of concern. That does often create that big heat dome across portions of the West Coast. And that does really impact us, especially looking at this topography map. We've got these interior valleys that get really, really hot in the summer. And then our coastal valleys are really marine influenced. And I do think that we're going to be seeing a lot of drying out happening. But as soon as we get into that later portion of the year, when rain becomes a little bit more of a factor, we're going to go from really hot and really dry. Hopefully it'll be an okay fire season. We're looking at some pretty intense fire conditions with just how much the grasses have grown. But I do hope that we'll see, because of the El Nino year, more rain, and at least kind of keep our gains a little bit better from what we saw this year, not just get rid of it pretty quickly.
Yeah. All right. We have a question on any connection between these events that happened this past winter and climate change. Are you hearing anything about possible links that can be, this early on, that can be determined?
I think it is a little too early to say definitively yes or no, but I do think we're continuing to see, and this at least from my perspective, many other people may have very different perspectives, but seeing storm systems that set up similarly 10, 20, 30 years ago, the same setup has more energy now and is causing more damage, maybe not as, not changing the frequency, not changing how frequently in the trajectory of these storms, but with more energy, more especially energy from our oceans as they do warm up. That does quickly bring us more energy in these atmospheric rivers. You get more evaporation when it's warmer, obviously, we all know that. And that does immediately bring us more precipitable water in these big events. And exactly like we were just talking about, as soon as it gets towards our coast, that additional precipitable water makes it worse. And I think that did play, at least in my vision, I do think that played a pretty big role in how much rain we were able to get from these systems. I don't know if it played a role in the systems forming, but at least how much rain we got from them, I do think there was an aspect.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That makes sense. A comment here from Todd that I wanted to mention because I don't want anyone to miss this. the Geological Society of America has a special session planned on this event for their upcoming national meeting. And he says, as an academic, it's great to see this kind of interdisciplinary interest. And yes, 1,000 times yes to that, Todd. One of the things that at the AMS, we've been doing a lot is engaging with the emergency management community. The International Association of Emergency Managers has started to, make their attendance known at our AMS meetings, and really kind of cementing that link between the forecast and the proper action that needs to be taken. That's something that we're doing a lot with the AMS. So it's good to see that there are other similar, I guess, sister societies and similar disciplines that are following suit with that.
Absolutely, that is fantastic to hear. I'll definitely be looking to see what some of the things that they say.
Yeah. A question from Carlos. He said that you were clear in the talk that topography plays a key role on the location of the precipitation. And he says, thank you for that. The last graphic that you had up, it showed a very uniform topography. So is there anything that you wanted to add about the atmospheric river? What makes it a narrow, it's hundreds of miles wide, so it's not really a narrow band, but you know what I mean? Like, what makes it kind of concentrated? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do think that we do see, especially with the mountains that kind of pop up, it is pretty flat compared to a lot of the rest of the country, but especially in the Los Padres National Forest, we have several mountains, especially areas like Figueroa Peak, if people are familiar with that area, that are upwards of about 3,000 feet. Pretty calm, especially compared to my growing up in Colorado and on the East Coast. But going from 0 to those higher peaks does really make a big impact. And I do think that kind of bringing a little bit more of that funnel of some of the worst impacts, some of our worst impacts were found in the Salinas River Valley and the San Ynez Valley, which is kind of in this area that I'm kind of highlighting there. And I do think a lot of those, I moved forward one. I think a lot of some of the impacts that we saw in that region are actually thanks to that big southwesterly flow kind of getting trapped between this first ridge of some of those peaks that are upwards of 2,000 feet and those actual areas where it started to drop a lot of that rain. I think that helped. It is still a really widespread event, and just those little elevation changes have made a pretty big difference. We saw a lot more rain than the Central Valley of California did, which is kind of up in this region. And then we had kind of a secondary portion of that mountain lift bring even more of that snow, especially to the interiors, especially into the Sierras. I think that helped. But I do think that for us, even though we don't have a ton of that relief of that elevation gain, I think we did have the perfect kind of direction of those transverse ranges really help to pull a lot of that water in. And I saw that specifically in the LA Basin, where they do see that dramatic elevation gain up to about 3,000 feet.
All right, excellent. All right, that's all the time that we have for today. For those of us on the East Coast, we are past the 8 p.m. hour. Just thank you so much for this amazing presentation, Vivian. And thank you to everyone who joined us. Gideon, I want to just quickly toss it back to you to wrap it up for this evening.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you so much, Vivian and Erica, for that. That was fascinating. It was fascinating and horrifying at the same time. And it was great to be able to just see what was going on behind that event and all the impacts and everything leading up to it. So thank you so much. And yes, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, I would like to say thank you for joining us as well. All webinars will be available to Weatherband members at amsweatherband.org. And if you have further questions, or if you want to talk about the webinar, please, if you're a member, you're welcome to discuss on the Weatherband Community Forum. But yeah, other than that, are there any other closing words or comments, Vivian or Erica? Or
I think all I'd like to say is if anybody does have any additional questions or would like to reach out about any of the things I said, all of my contact info is on the screen. And just thank you guys so much for kind of listening to what we had happen here on the Central Coast this year.
Thank you, Vivian. And let me see if I get this right. Thank you.
Perfect.
Awesome. All righty. Take care, everybody. Have a great evening, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Bye.